Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. As many of you know, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year by highlighting our policy research programs on energy, health, science, foreign affairs, and this program is part of what we do on the Middle East. We're truly delighted to welcome back to the Institute this evening Dr. James Zogby. Jim is the director of the public opinion research firm Zogby Research Services. He's the president of the Arab American Institute and is one of the leading scholars of public opinion in the Arab world. I've appeared on his wonderful TV program, Viewpoint, several times. That's broadcast widely in the Arab world. And he asks very probing questions. He takes no prisoners. He is the author of Arab Voices, which I really commend. It's what they are saying to us and why it matters, a very illuminating book about Arab public opinion. And Jim is active in the Democratic Party for most of his life, and he doesn't shun away from controversy. He speaks truth to power, and he brings upon a lot of controversy to himself, and he's not even an Armenian, and he does that. So as I've indicated, Jim has authored numerous books and reports analyzing the critical issues of the Middle East and this is very important, by first listening to the people of the region. We don't do that enough in our foreign policy formulation, simply listening before we begin to act. In this, he is a key advocate for effective U.S. public diplomacy in the Arab world, which requires us, as I said, to listen first before understanding, informing, engaging, and influencing Arab society and populations. Tonight's event highlights Jim's recent work on the topic of Iran. He's written this very illuminating study on looking at Iran, the rise and fall of Iran in public opinion. I really commend it. It's a very interesting book of insights on Iran's standing in the Muslim world in terms of public opinion. Very worthwhile reading. This is obviously an issue with important implications for American national security policy regarding Iran's nuclear program and the concomitant threat to Israel and the region as a whole, as well as Iran's influence and involvement in Iraq, the Arab Gulf countries, and, of course, in Syria. As Jim has noted, viewing Iran only through the lens of national security inhibits open conversation and debate on the full spectrum of U.S. policy options on Iran and constrains American foreign policy in the broader Middle East. The research conducted by Dr. Zogby over 20,000 surveys in 20 countries, and I understand is a valuable contribution to the greater understanding of Iran from the perspective of its Arab neighbors. So as the Middle East undergoes this tectonic shift on a political, social, economic levels, it is more important than ever that policymakers in Washington study public opinion to examine changing perceptions, identify threats, and chart informed public policy course for U.S. engagement in the region. Jim's work helps explain how this can be done. Jim will be signing copies of this study after his lecture and the Q&A that we're going to have. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zogby to the podium.
Oh, thank you, Ed, very much, and thanks all of you for coming. I would say from the start that it's a joy to be here. I was telling Ed on the way in that I learned some of my most important lessons about Syria from the U.S.-Syria dialogue that you ran and that I had the great opportunity to be a part of. I always have to say to people, on the U.S. team. And one of the stories that bothered me most and I write about in my book was I was doing an NPR show with Daniel Shore. And I was on with somebody else who wasn't a U.S. citizen, And he asked, now that we're on our way to war with Iraq, this was back during that period, the first Gulf War, he said, what should our policy be towards Saddam Hussein? And the other guest said, what he thought should be done. And I said, well, what I think we ought to be saying, and he stopped on air and he said, when you say we, who do you mean? And being sort of taken aback, I said something stupid like, us, America. I played Little League when I was a kid. I mean, I didn't know any other way to answer the question. I'm an American. But I thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate. And I, like I said, learned from the dialogue here and from the one in Syria. So much of what we actually see playing out today, an absolutely tone-deaf regime, just unable to get what needs to be done to save its own country and to save its people. You said nice things about me, but I can't say enough about you. You are the consummate. There is no body I've known in all the years in Washington in the diplomatic corps who gets what diplomacy is. And your book, I recommend, and I was so proud to be able to have interviewed you for book notes, C-SPAN's book notes on that, but also the little plaque you have in your office for the Iraq Study Group report, which you were one of the principals behind. I call it the most talked about, most purchased, least read book in contemporary American history. Everybody talked about it. Nobody read it. If they'd read it and applied it, we wouldn't be dealing with what we're dealing with today, and it's a damn shame. It's a damn shame that we didn't apply it. A note about polling. Something I've learned from my work and from my brother, John, who actually branded the family name with polling. Polling is listening. It's ultimately the science of listening. The motto of our little company, Zogby Research, is every voice matters. Because it does. You may not like what you hear, but if you're serious about engaging people, about dealing with them as they are, you ought not to be operating through the prism of what you think them to be, but rather through the lens of who they really are. And Arab Voices, was all it was about. It was about what Arabs are saying and why, when we don't listen to them, we get into trouble, and what the consequences are of not listening. This is about Iran. It's about what Arabs and other Muslims think about Iran, and is important because, as I say, when we talk about this, we oftentimes don't pay attention to what people in the region are themselves saying. In fact, talking about Iran in America usually focuses on Israel. It's what Israel's concern is. And I'm going to argue with you tonight that it is the least significant issue with regard to Iran, both for Iran, but also in the broader region. Leaving Arabs out of the discussion is a huge mistake, because Iran's target is not Israel. Iran's target is across the water. And Israel is a convenient foil. It's a way of them sort of establishing their bona fides with an alienated Arab public opinion. And so ignoring that public opinion is fundamentally wrong. We've known that Arab governments, we found out from WikiLeaks, if we didn't know it before that Arab governments had a problem with Iran and sometimes expressed themselves to American diplomats quite freely. And there was a time, just a few years ago, in our polling in 2006, for example, when favorable Arab opinion toward Iran stood in stark contrast to what Arab governments were saying. There was a time when, for example, the Saudi royal family and the leadership of the country were very opposed to Iran. But in 2006, 85% of Saudis had a favorable opinion of Iran. And so much was made of this. Much was made of the fact that Arab public opinion was here, leadership was there, and never the twain should meet. But we've been polling now for over a decade on these questions in the broader region. And what we have found over each of the years, and I'll just sort of flip this one slide so you can take a look at it, is that in just 6 of the countries, public opinion was extraordinarily high in 2006. but has continued to drop in almost every one of the countries. I'll talk about Lebanon in just a minute. It's a special case, and you need to understand it. Has dropped precipitously low in most of the countries. The factors that are here that I want to talk about that account for this is what becomes quite interesting. Number one, it was not in the early years sect. Sectarian division had nothing to do with Iran. You don't get 85% favorable ratings in Saudi Arabia if it's a sectarian issue, because Saudi Arabia is 95% Sunni. And back in early 2008, before the big decline began to occur, we asked Saudis, name a leader off the top of your mind, top of your head, without any prompted suggestion. We said, name a leader who you most respect, not from your own country. Here's what we got. In Saudi Arabia, the number one was Hassan Nasrallah, the Shia leader in Lebanon of Hezbollah. The number two was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the head of Iran. Number three was Bashar al-Assad. Those are the top three leaders in Saudi Arabia. Almost 51% of overall Saudi opinion said those three guys. It's not sect. It was something else. There was another dynamic there, and that's what we were trying to get at. What is the dynamic that's at work? What was taking place then that isn't taking place now? When Iran began, modern Iran began, the revolution that led to the Islamic Republic of Iran, it had actually two messages to the world. One was that it was revolutionary, that it was a people's revolution. And in fact, you know, if you recall back then in that period, it was quite striking. We haven't seen anything like it, even in Cairo. There was more violence in Cairo than there was in Iran, in terms of the fact that the popular upheaval that took place in the streets was massive. And at one point, the military just said, no, forget it, and the Shah had to flee. And it was a rather glorious, peaceful revolution. And so, to some degree, the argument they made that it was a popular revolt and that they were the leaders of this populist movement could be true. But there was something else going on there, and that was the almost Stalinist-like behavior of the clergy once they took over from the moderate leadership who had led that revolution, not unlike other situations we see play out in history. They inherited and took it over and began to impose a different kind of regime, but still use the rhetoric of it being a populist movement. In the words of Ayatollah Khomeini, it wasn't a Shia Sunni movement, it was Islam, and they were going to be projecting this revolutionary movement across the Islamic world to unite all Muslims under this banner. There was also an undercurrent of Shiism to this. It was a cry of the oppressed Shia in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Lebanon. They didn't overstate the case because they wanted to keep this appeal alive for all Muslims, but it was very much there. And they began finding allies throughout the region and funding and supporting. I mean, Hezbollah, which adopted the Iranian model, began in about the same time and began to receive its funding and its support from and training from the Iranian movement. Those two currents were there. Israel was a factor all this time. And it was a factor as part, as I said, of the targeting. Not the targeting of Israel, but the targeting across the water. And it reached its apex. Actually, 82 was a big year for this. But in 2006 was maybe the biggest, because you had Israel having devastated Lebanon in a wholly tragic way. You had Israel having made this assault on Gaza, which got overlooked after the assault on Lebanon in the same year. And you had the U.S. in its absolute low point in Iraq, all in 2006. Arab public opinion was furious at U.S. and Israel. And there you had Iran saying, we are the populist revolution. We are the leaders of the revolt, of the resistance against the machinations of the West. People believed it. And they said, look at your own leaders. Your own leaders are weak. Your own leaders can do nothing to stop all this. But we are the challenge. They had no intention of doing anything, but they had a lot of intention of exploiting this. I'll never forget James Baker in September 4th. I actually remember the date. 1990, September 4th. He appeared before Congress. Saddam had gone into Kuwait just a month earlier rather, and he was testifying before Mel Levine, who later became a partner of mine in a project we worked on together. And Mel Levine said, we see Palestinians cheering for Saddam Hussein. We see Palestinians having allied with this invader. Shouldn't this mean that we give up on them and just forsake this whole notion of making peace and just drop it? And Baker gave an extraordinarily wise response. He said, Saddam Hussein appears as the hero to these alienated and frustrated Palestinians. And therefore, it makes it all the more important that we address this issue, to remove the ground that he's preying off of. He's preying off of alienation and frustration in much the same way that Iran did in 2006, that gave them. So one of the lessons we learn in all of this survey work that we do is that when Iran is seen through the prism of Israel and the West, it wins. If it is able to pose as the counter to that, it begins to win. But something else began to happen, beginning in 2008 with the election of President Obama and with several other developments in the region. And I want to talk about what some of them are. The first, number one, with the election of President Obama was the lowering of the American profile in the region, less bellicose language. If you had George Bush going and giving a speech, as he did at the National Defense University toward the end of his term, as things were pretty bad in Iraq. I remember he gave this speech. It was not the end of his term. It was 2006-07, something like that. And he compared Iran and the move to establish the caliphate in language that was reminiscent of the way we used to talk about the Comintern in the Soviet Union. And I said to myself, why are we making them so big? Why are we sort of building them up to the point where we're equating them with Nazi Germany? We're equating them with Stalin's Russia. We're making them into this world-class giant, which is exactly what they want. They wanted to appear to the Arab masses that they are the liberators, the big challenge to the West. And lowering the profile, lowering the rhetoric, no longer gives them the ammunition to respond. The second thing that happened was the Green Movement. And when the Green Movement in 2009 erupted after that election in massive demonstrations, and the Iranian regime cracked down rather brutally, and the scenes were visible all across the world, they lost the ability to argue that they were the people's revolution. They were the leaders of the resistance. They now became a brutal regime that crushed their own people. A third factor is Turkey. An emergent Turkey displaced Iran and, in fact, became a more responsible player in the Arab context. For example, 2006, the same year that Israel is doing what it did and Ahmadinejad is making his noises everywhere, you have a very different situation playing out with Turkey. The Prime Minister of Turkey appears a year later at Davos with Shimon Peres, and Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, is making some argument defending what Israel had done, and Erdogan said, I'm not taking it. It's nonsense, it's distortion, it's lies, it's whatever. And he stormed off the stage in fury. That resonated in the Arab world significantly. They said, this is a leader. This is a leader who actually now stands up. And actually in the polling that we did in years following that, What you got was the leader of Turkey eclipsing the others in several of the countries, eclipsing the Iranians and Nasrallah, et cetera, as the guy they could look to. So Turkey actually, as Iran's numbers went down, you'll see in a later slide, Turkey's numbers began to go up and reached a high point in 2010. Another factor is as the U.S. rhetoric softened, or the U.S. became less of a sort of a threatening player in the region, as the U.S. left Iraq, as the situation became transformed with the Arab Spring and other developments in the region that began to refocus attention, Iran all of a sudden appeared in its own right. So the prism through which people saw Iran was no longer Israel and the U.S., but it was Iran's own behavior. And Iran's behavior in Bahrain, clearly its behavior in Iraq, which is now viewed as an Iranian satellite in much of the Arab world, Iran's behavior in Lebanon, and Iran's behavior in Syria have now come to the forefront and caused genuine concern across the Arab world. What this has led to is a sectarian divide that is, it was always there below the surface, but it has now erupted in something quite significant. Sunni attitudes completely opposed to Iran in most countries, and Shia attitudes now being very supportive of Iran. And there's a growing consensus that this is a problem among Sunni and Shia. And interestingly enough, when we ask the question, who is most responsible for this divide, both Sunni and Shia agree that it is Iran, which I find quite interesting. And to some degree, the Arab Spring contributed to this. When you had Sunni movements leading or inheriting the revolution in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Libya, when you had a Shia majority rebelling in Bahrain, when you had a Sunni majority rebelling against a non-Sunni leadership in Syria, all of this played into the sectarian game and put everyone, including Iran, in a difficult position. They were viewed as anathema in North Africa, except in Egypt, which has tried to make some interesting ties, but they've always fallen through. When the president of Iran comes to Egypt, he gets a shoe thrown at him and he gets cursed out by the head of Al-Azhar, even though I think the president of Egypt was trying to make nice because he was trying to play off Iran against Saudi Arabia to see if he could get some more money for his country. Didn't quite pan out. But this sectarian divide has now become a fact of life in the region and is a huge divide. We'll see that in the numbers in just a minute. And the other thing we'll see is that even with the sectarian divide, there's a factor here that is quite interesting, and that is the attachment to Arab culture and identity, which even in the countries where the sectarian divide is huge, people's attachment to being Arab transcends their sense of being Sunni or Shia. So there is this mitigating factor that plays out. I would say, though, that from everything we've seen in the polling, in particular, Syria is the nail in Iran's coffin of Arab public opinion. What's true about attitudes generally toward Iran is even more true about attitudes towards Iran's nuclear program. And it's quite striking. In the numbers that we got in 2006, we asked the question, is Iran seeking nuclear weapon, or is Iran seeking nuclear power for peaceful purposes? Overwhelmingly, Arabs responded peaceful purposes. And when asked if the UN or international community supported sanctions against Iran, would you support them? Overwhelmingly, there was a rejection. And so too a rejection on military strikes as well. In the 2012 poll, in most countries, the very large majority say it is a nuclear program seeking weaponization. And in almost all of the countries we poll, I think 15 out of the 20, the answer is we would support sanctions against Iran. Military strikes, no. Military strikes are still opposed, but the numbers are moving upward, and I think quite dangerously for as far as Iran is concerned. So there was no support for its nuclear ambitions. There was support for its ambitions and belief, or at least suspended disbelief, in 2006, and there is now a clear feeling that it's a nuclear program designed for weapons and no support for it. But opposition to the military is still high. I repeat, the lesson of all this is that when Iran is seen through the prism of the West and Israel, it wins. When it's seen through the lens of its own behavior, it loses. Now, a couple of lessons as far as policy goes. The first is that Arab and Muslim public opinion remains very much in flux, and regional sensitivities are high, and given this, it's a very volatile setting. You're going to see in a minute the Lebanon numbers. I wouldn't bet that if I took the poll today, 6 months after the last one we did, the Lebanon numbers would be completely transformed. It is that volatile in the region. The first lesson is for Iran itself. It should recognize that its current regional isolation and precariousness is very real. And it is isolated and should learn not to overplay its hand. I don't know if they will or not, but that's the real lesson that comes through here. In the past, their defiant behavior played to a supportive audience. It is not playing to a supportive audience right now. What they did once when the president of Iran made his boasts and made his claims and made his threats, alienated people across the water cheered, against even their own leaders. And today, when he makes the same boasts and the same threats, he's looked as a threatening nuisance and an unsettling provocateur. And that is something I think that the Iranians need to understand. I'm not sure they do. The second is a lesson for the other governments in the region. They have to address domestic concerns, especially the domestic concerns that foment sectarian division. If they are going to eliminate this problem, they've got to eliminate the source of the problem. A majority Shia population in Bahrain cannot continue to suffer the kind of discrimination that they suffer. The situation in Syria is simply untenable and remains untenable and requires a solution. And dispossessed minorities in Saudi Arabia, groups that are discriminated against, simply create the fodder for someone across the water to exploit. And if you want to end the exploitation, you have to remove the conditions that lead to that exploitation. And so work has to be done there, and more work has to be done on corralling in and putting an end to the sectarian terrorism. It was not even during the Iraq War. I remember getting in trouble on the TV show when I talked about terrorism, and this is not terrorism, this is resistance against the occupation. Nonsense. When they're blowing up Shia mosques, that was not resistance against the occupation. When they were ethnically cleansing Baghdad, that had nothing to do with resistance against the occupation. They were terrorist acts against their own population that was designed to foment fear and to literally to destroy the population base of an entire community. And in Pakistan, the same problem. In most of these countries, sectarian violence must be controlled. It can only be, the focus can't only be on terrorism against the West or terrorism designed to target the West or target Israel. The domestic terrorism problem is huge. And if it has a sectarian intent, then it is destroying the very fabric of these societies, and it must be addressed. There's also a lesson in this for Israel and for the West in dealing with Israel. Israel has to be pressed to address and finally resolve the long-standing issue of the denial of Palestinian rights. Because should the Palestinian situation explode again, and should, as I fully expect, the U.S. would end up siding with Israel It would inflame regional passions, and it would reopen the very door that Iran closed on itself. The best distraction that could occur right now that would take Iran off the hot seat and put it right back in the center of being the leader of the resistance would be if there were a massive uprising or some violence or some distraction that occurred between Palestinians and Israel, and the U.S. ended up coming out as it would in favor of the Israeli position. And so the issue has got to be resolved. It is central to too many of the issues that we care about in the broader region. And in this context, it's important to understand that when I wrote the book Arab Voices, I was actually writing for an American audience about listening to Arab voices. After Arab Spring, Arab voices now matter to Arab governments more than ever before. They know that their own people matter. They may not always listen to them, and they may not always move in a democratic direction, but they are very aware of the fact that public opinion at home now matters. And their ability to control that public opinion is huge. And it is an issue that we have to pay attention to. I remember during the beginning part of the revolt in Egypt, I got a call from an NPR reporter, and she said to me, if we dumped Mubarak, wouldn't our standing go up in the Middle East? And I said, you got it backwards. We're not unpopular in Egypt because we supported Mubarak. He's unpopular in Egypt because he supported us. He supported us in the Iraq War. He supported us in being quiet when Israel was doing what it did in Gaza. He supported us by doing nothing when Israel was devastating Lebanon. And all of these things, he became a way station on the road to rendition and tortured his own people, frequently at our request. And all of those things were known in Egypt and produced massive resentment against him and his government. Arab governments are less willing to play that game right now. And given that, if a situation gets out of control, we can't expect Arab leaders to do as they've done in the past, which is, I remember back in 2005, we did a poll in across the region. America's favorable rating in Jordan was 5%. And I short while later, President Bush is trying to do something with al-Maliki, about a year later or so, and he goes to Jordan to meet with Maliki, because that was the only place he could actually do it. He wasn't going to do it in Baghdad, and so he met him in Jordan. And there was King Abdullah meeting President Bush, coming off the plane, greeting him, hugging him, whatever, and walking him through the honor guard. And I thought to myself, God, if that were a congressman, and the president were coming to his district, and the president had a 5% favorable rating, he'd have a bingo game to go to that night. Oh, sorry, I've got a long-standing engagement, I can't do it. Congressmen stiff the president when the president's rating is 40%, not 5%. But Arab leaders have subordinated their own public opinion to their desire to remain close to the West. That is going to become less and less a likely occurrence as public opinion matters more in the Arab world. And the demonstrations in front of the embassy in Tahrir Square and events like that continue to make that point clear. And finally, there's a lesson for the U.S. As well. We did focus groups after the poll to kind of figure out some of the meaning of what we were seeing in the numbers. One of the things that struck me was when we did we asked the question about why did America's ratings go up so high? And what we got was leading from behind. They used that expression. And I thought to myself, the very issue that the president is being attacked for at home is the issue that resonates so well in the Arab world. They like a leader who actually lets you be out front, that does not make threats, that does not make hollow boasts, that does not make, that lord his power my way or the highway, wanted, dead or alive, all of the stuff that we did back a decade ago. They liked America speaking softer and behaving differently. But should America change course and either resume its belligerent posture or take unsupported and unpopular unilateral military action against Iran, this would only serve to refocus the region's attention away from Iran's meddlesome behaviors and once again become a challenge to America, and it would shift attitudes, I believe, again toward Iran's behavior. And that applies not only to the United States, but to Israel and to Iran itself. At this point, threats and bellicose behavior don't serve anything. They just exacerbate tension and deepen divides. And they play into the hands of those in Iran who have repeatedly demonstrated the ability to turn threats or actual attack into an increase in support across the region. That's the finding. I'm going to show you the pictures in just a minute. Here's the first slide, and that is demonstrating this dramatic decline from 2006 to 2011. These are the U.S. favorable ratings in the same period. Notice the spike in 2005 and the spike in 2009 when an American president, when we have a new election, people begin to see that there's a chance that something new might happen. George Bush disappointed in 2006, and the numbers dropped again. President Obama disappointed, and in 2010 and 2011, the numbers dropped even more significantly. This is attitudes towards Iran in 2012. And now here's interesting. You're going to see that Iran's numbers go up slightly in 2012. And the reason they go up in 2012 is because the Shia-Sunni divide becomes real. Turkey's numbers also go down, and that's because where Iran's numbers went up, it was because the Shia population was now, it's sort of when you have a Republican running against a Democrat and the Republican hasn't solidified his base. When Romney solidified his base at the Republican convention, his numbers went up. And the numbers went up not from independents or Democrats, but because Republicans were now confident with their guy. You now have this Shia movement in the direction of Iran. A word about Lebanon. Lebanon is interesting in all the years that we polled in Lebanon. Yes, there is a sectarian divide. It's real. No question about it. There's some issues that Lebanese all agree on. They agree on matters that Lebanese politicians don't address. I always said if I had a Lebanese president as a candidate that I was working for, I'd tell him, don't focus on the stuff people disagree with, focus on the stuff people agree with. They all agree that there needs to be a reform of the system toward one man, one vote. They all agree that there has to be an improvement of jobs and health care and education and stuff that improve the quality of life so that people don't emigrate and people can actually stay in the country. And they all, they agree on so many things. Where they disagree on is issues that actually end up internalizing or not internalizing, or accenting this internal divide. They disagree on Syria. They disagree on Hezbollah and arms for Hezbollah. But what they didn't disagree on was Iran. And here's why. Because unlike every other Arab country that sees Israel through the lens of Palestine, in every Arab country, when we ask questions in open-ended about Israel, they talk about Palestine. In Lebanon, they talk about Lebanon. Lebanon has its own axe to grind on this. And they saw Iran through the prism of 2006. Until 2012, they had not gotten over it. Like I said, I don't think now, if I polled 6 months later, I would get the same response. Lebanese are deeply divided on Syria, but they weren't divided on Iran. And when we asked, we re-polled on this, and we got the same numbers. And what they told us was, after 2006, nobody defended us but Iran. After 2006, nobody gave us any support but Iran. The U.S. stood by, didn't say anything. The U.S. didn't contribute to the rebuilding of the South. The Arab governments didn't do anything to rebuild. That's what they were telling us in the focus groups, and so Iran got a pass for a number of years. Iraq, obviously, it's the sect issue, the same in Yemen. In Algeria and Libya, there's an unsettled revolutionary fervor that is going on that I don't quite understand and I don't quite know what to do with. But in every other country, majorities are opposed to Iran. Iran's role in Iraq, the same. Iran's role on the Green Movement, the same. Never siding with the government except in Yemen and Lebanon, Algeria, and Libya. Every other country siding with the Green Movement. The role in Bahrain, the same. And the role in Syria, worst of all. That was the one that conflicted me most about Lebanon, was the Lebanese still have, it was fascinating, not just Christian and Sunni, but also among Shia, a tremendous resentment of what Bashar al-Assad had done in Lebanon. Now, Christians began moving toward the Syria situation because they began to feel vulnerable in Syria. They didn't want a Syria that was going to change from being a secular country where Christians felt protected. But there was this unsettled sense and this division on Syria. But when it came to Iran's role in Syria, when we asked them about Hezbollah's role in Syria, they were divided right down the middle. But when you asked them about Iran's role, they gave Iran a pass again. Turkey's favorable ratings. Turkey's favorable ratings continued to go up, 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 and then all of a sudden the Sunni-Shia divide occurs and Turkey's numbers go down. Iran's nuclear objectives, Lebanon's still giving them a pass, saying it was peaceful. I mean, it actually became, I know it became a little disconcerting here. Iran has nuclear ambitions, nuclear weapon ambitions. In 2006, the numbers are in purple. Only Turkey back then believed that they wanted a nuclear weapon. Every other country didn't believe it. In 2012, every country but Morocco, majorities do believe it. Economic sanctions. Stronger support than before. You'll see here's support for sanctions. This is what they were in 2006 in purple. This is what they are in blue in 2012. But military action against Iran, something that nobody wants except for a plurality in Turkey and a just even almost 50% majority in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan holds no court for the Turks. I mean for Iran, rather, sorry. Military action, still opposed. Increasing, but still opposed. Majorities everywhere but Turkey. This is that early 2008 survey on Nasrallah, Assad, and Ahmadinejad. Attitudes towards Iran by sect. Favorable attitudes in 2012. Look at the divide in particular in Bahrain, in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, no Sunni support, and in Pakistan. Blue are the Shia numbers and orange are the Sunni numbers. Comparing cultures.
Inferior.
I get that.
That's Lebanese.
No, that's bad spelling is what it is, nothing else. Oh my gosh, you saw that right away. I've shown this slide, I don't know how many times, and nobody caught it. Thank you. The U.S. contributes to stability in the Arab world. Look at those numbers. And in 2010 and 11, the numbers were through the floor. And they went up in 2012. And this is the one we asked the questions about, and this is where we got the leading from behind. That one seemed to make an impact. And that's it. We're done. Okay, now, just one final comment. No comments. I think I'll just end there and I'll take questions. That's what I'll do. Thank you. Yes. Oh, sorry, you recognize.
That's fine.
Okay, go on.
On the slides on the military strikes, are you polling the population saying if our country performs the military
No.
strikes, or if somebody,
If the the way we did it was if the international community authorized military strikes against Iran, would you support them?
Thank you.
We used international community. And we used the same in 2006. It was the same wording. Because and I actually got criticized by, there's a couple of, what would the word be, Iranophiles in Washington. I mean, they're friends and I respect them and like them, but they criticized me for not asking the question if the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran. But that's like a no-brainer question. It's like if you load it that way, if you say, if Iran and Israel attacked, if the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran, would you support it? The answer is going to be no, because there's only one country less popular in the Middle East than Iran, and that's Israel. So it's like, you just don't stack it that way. But yeah, that's how we asked it. You want to? Yeah.
Question, Jim, this is probably going a little bit off topic, but can you address or give us your opinion on what Putin and Russia's goals are in the Middle East? What are they doing?
I think Ed is probably more capable of responding than I would just say that I think that they, from everything I've read, I'm not a Russian expert, they felt betrayed on the Libya situation. They felt cut out, and they didn't want to lose a base. They didn't want to lose a position of support. And I can't help but believe that from everything I've seen with Russia under Putin, that he has ambitions for greater things for Russia, kind of a rebuilding of not the Soviet Union, but of a Russian pole in a bipolar or multipolar world, and doesn't want to surrender that. And so this is a kind of a last stand in the region. He doesn't have many other places to go. And I also think that there's a fear of extremism. I mean, I think I would accept that the statement that Kerry and Lavrov came out with was something that probably both believed, that a negotiated solution is ultimately the only one. And I, as difficult as it is to imagine, I can't imagine a victor vanquished scenario in Turkey. It couldn't be in Lebanon, huh?
Sorry.
I mean, I'm sorry, it couldn't work in Lebanon, it couldn't work in Turkey, in Iran, I'm sorry, in Iraq, and it's not going to work in Syria either. So I think that they believe that, and I think they also believe that there's a fear of extremism. And the folks who are in Syria today, we're going to see them playing out across the region in the years to come. I mean, we saw it in Afghanistan. It's the new base, the new place where extremists are being trained, and people want to deny it as much as they want to deny it, but the reality is that we're going to be facing this problem with all of these guys who've gone in. And one of the things we never understood about Afghanistan that we learned with Al-Qaeda was that it was a lot like the Vietnam veterans situation, where these guys went off to war, they saw hell, they came back destroyed, and they got nothing. They were rejected when they got home. I mean, my office is in the building where there's a veterans group that does a lot of legal and social welfare work with veterans. And back 30 years ago when I moved into that building, they were just dealing with one set of problems. Largest percentage of homeless guys in Washington were Vietnam vets. Largest percentage of guys who were getting drug counseling and or mental health counseling were Vietnam vets who had not been dealt with when they needed it, and were now a problem in the 80s and going on in the 90s. In the same way, when that Afghanistan war was over and these guys had gone to do jihad and had been encouraged by their parents and by their families, to fight for whatever against the Soviet thing, they came back to Saudi Arabia and they were threatened, they were feared, they were rejected, and so they went back to where they belonged, where they felt like we have a camaraderie. And in fighting, in war, in that kind of battle situation, relationships get built and mindsets get developed that are difficult to undo unless you get serious counseling and help. And I don't think that the guys after the Syria war are going to get it, because it's simply not a part of the regime. I don't mean regime, the government regime. I mean the way we deal with problems in the region and the culture. And so what I'm afraid of is that we're going to have this whole group of guys who have known nothing but each other and fighting, and they're going to be off to the next one when it's over. And so I believe the Russians and the Americans both share those two concerns, that there can only be a negotiated solution and that extremism is going to be a problem we're going to be living with for a long time growing out of this. And in addition to that, for the Russians, it's a base. It's a place where they don't want to give up a place of operations in the region.
To follow up on that question, I was going to ask if you think that the Russians want to evidence terrorism enough that they could have been behind Boston.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Although, I mean, I use Occam's razor in situations like this. The simpler solution is always the one that I go with. Yeah.
The depth of your knowledge is profound, and your presentation was beautiful.
Can I quote you one?
You've let us big elephant in the middle of the room, though.
Which is?
You can repeat that.
What should the West do when Iran gets its hands on a functional nuclear device?
Well, the question is actually, what does Iran do when it gets its hands on a functional nuclear device? It can sit on it, it can eat it, it can try to feed its people with it, but it can never use it. I remember in '84, I was a part of the debate in the Democratic Party on a resolution we wanted to pass that the party wouldn't agree to, called, it was no first use. And we said the U.S. should agree that we will never use nuclear weapons at first. I forget the language exactly, but it was no first use. That's how we abbreviated. I remember at one point Jesse Jackson saying, this is stupid. This is a stupid discussion. There's no first use, there's no second use, there's no use at all. Because he compared it to, he said, it's like walking down a dark alley at night and you run into George Foreman. And he said, and he's looking threatening at you. You got a choice. You say to yourself, I'm going to hit him first so he doesn't hit me. 5 seconds later, you're dead. You can take your licks and try to deal with it, or you can try to talk to him about it. But the bottom line is that there is no, if Iran ever used it, it's a parking lot. And we know that. Israel's had them all these years, doesn't use. I don't believe anyone's going to use them, ever, because there's no point to it. No state. But there's also the fact that we can trace non-state users and where they get it from if they use it. So the fact, and if Hezbollah uses it, Iran's still a parking lot. I mean, the fact is there's no tolerance for the use of it. We are the only country who's ever used it. And we couldn't ever use it again because there's no tolerance in the world community for its use. My sense is that instead of playing the game we play, which is right into his hands. I mean, I remember when Pakistan got it, when there was all this stuff about the Islamic bond, they loved it because it was exactly what they wanted, bragging rights against India. They were never going to use it. India was much more powerful. They wanted it for bragging rights. They wanted to be the first Muslim country. We have the bomb. They can't feed their people. They can't pave their roads. They can't provide electricity in villages, but they have a bomb, so they have bragging rights in the Muslim world. Got them nowhere. My best sense is that the way to deal with him, instead of building him up, the supreme leader, as a supreme leader who wants a nuclear bomb and is threatening us all, oh, poor us, Iran is... I would use the opposite. I'd use ridicule. I'd say, what are you going to do, little man? You want a bomb? What are you going to do with your bomb? You're going to feed your people? You're going to sit on it? You're going to what are you going to do with it? You can't do anything. I mean, the point is that they are little guys. They are not the place they threaten is across the water, and they've been real threats. They're not a threat to us. Instead of, when George Bush gave that speech, I said, why is he elevating them to the equal of us? How nonsensical. Why should they tie us all up in knots when in fact they are controllable? And we got ourselves into verbal knots. We drew red lines we shouldn't have drawn. If they don't do this by December, we're going to do this. And as December comes, and what do we do? Because there's nothing that we really can do that would make the situation better. What President Obama failed at was in delivering the promise of his election in 2008, which was direct engagement. We've had this nonsensical notion in American politics that if you talk to somebody, you elevate them and you reward them. Diplomacy is about talking to people to solve problems and to put them in their place. And instead, by not talking to them, we elevate them. And that's, I think, been a fundamental mistake.
I think you should be the president.
No, I'm the president of the Arab American Institute, and that's big enough.
It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
You kind of brought the Iran reputation went up and down when they start threatening Israel. And Turkey went up and down. So just make the story short, everything is connected to United States and to Israel. The Middle East, with the Arab world, the Muslim world, does not like the idea of having a Jewish state in the Middle East. So doesn't anybody in Washington, since they do have, I don't know if they do control Israel, not, you know, where says Israel controls the United States, but that's another story. But don't anybody see that the solution is to get rid of this issue and have a peace solution with the Palestinian and Israel, and all the problems will be solved? I think so.
Well, it's not all the problems would be solved, but a problem would be solved. It would be one layer of the onion that would be removed, allowing us to get to some other core problems that have to be solved. And those core problems are now going unresolved and becoming, you know, festering and becoming worse because our ability to function is limited because of this issue. And I think that, I don't know, because we haven't polled on this in 2 years, but when I polled for my book, the last poll we did for Arab Voices, which was in 2010, I was struck by the fact that 3/4 of Arab public opinion supported a negotiated solution based on a two-state Israeli-Palestinian resolution. And it flew in the face of all of the stuff about Arabs don't accept Israel. And I never quite got the reason why that poll didn't get more traction back then. Again, I don't know if the numbers are still the same, but I know that there was an acceptance of it and a desire to solve it. We've gone a long way. I'll never forget, in right before Shepherdstown, Farouk Sharaf came to Washington, and he gave a speech that he wasn't supposed to give. He went at the White House with the Israeli and the president, and they came out to meet the press, and what he was supposed to do was do oh, we're so glad to be here and we're going to go. But Shara actually read a speech. And the focus of the press the next day was he gave a speech and he shouldn't have given a speech. It wasn't the time for the speech and nobody wanted to hear a speech. But they didn't listen to the speech, which was so significant. He said, this is not an existential conflict. Our conflict with Israel is not about your existence. It's about borders. And he said, if we have this solution to borders, we will have trade and we will have commerce. It was a rather stunning statement for somebody who was obviously speaking on behalf of this rather rigid party that doesn't allow freelancers, you know? And we missed it. I do believe that Arabs have gone a long way, including the Palestinians from the beginning. Of accepting, and now because we rejected all of that, we now have Hamas, we now have Hezbollah, we now have groups that don't do it, and I'm afraid that the longer this goes on, and more calamity and more catastrophe and more suffering, the numbers will be eroded even further. But clearly, there is a mood in the region that says enough's enough. Let's put an end to it and let's find a way to get a just solution. And I don't think the Arab League would have done what it did had it not felt that its own public was ready for it, because they don't want to face the retribution. They want the problem over. And I do believe that the time is now to do it.
Nobel laureate. About how people identify primarily with as Arabs.
Yeah,
The Iranians aren't Arabs, the Turks aren't Arabs.
yeah.
Afghanistan people aren't Arabs. How does that fit in with their thinking about?
Well, I think that there's in many of the questions we asked in the poll, and I would recommend the book, which is available on Amazon. It's an e-book, but we have a print copy here. And look at the culture questions, which were to me quite interesting, because there's a matched poll that we did 3 months earlier, which is online at the Arab American Institute website and on my Zogby Research Services website, on how non-Arabs look at Arab culture. So we wanted to sort of pair them up. It's healthy. People respect their own culture, and they see their own culture as better than the other guy's culture, which is a good thing, I think, in most instances. The Turks maybe love their culture a little too much. When we asked questions in Turkey, we asked one question in all of these polls. We said, should one country lead Islam, or should all Islamic countries be equal? And in Turkey, 88% said one country should lead, and 100% of them said it should be Turkey. At the other end of the continuum, the Pakistanis, the most humble and maybe the only real ummah consciousness in the Muslim world, a tiny minority said one country should lead, and none of them said it should be Pakistan. Those who said it should said Saudi Arabia or whatever. So there's a different mindset there in Turkey. Right after them is Iran. Iran has a real sense of the importance of their culture. So I was intrigued when we polled countries like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or UAE or Oman or Yemen, where you have a big Shia population. Were they going to have been influenced by, as a result of this growing sectarianism, to believe that Iranian culture was superior to Arab culture, that Iranian contributions to Islam were superior to Arab contributions? We asked questions: who's more knowledgeable, who's more generous, who is more violent? They all thought Iran was more violent. They all thought Arabs were more generous, more knowledgeable, and made a bigger contribution to Islam. The only place where we had a difference, that we really saw the sectarian divide real, was in Bahrain, which is a very real problem, because you have now in Bahrain a Bahraini Shia population that no longer feels that their Arabness is important. And they actually look across the water the other way, and they see them, the Iranians, as providing that kind of historic leadership that they look to. So yeah, there's a lot there, I think, to sort of burrow in and look at.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut off the questions because we have to give time for the book signing.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask you, I don't know how appropriate this is, but can democracy succeed in the Arab world? I mean, obviously it succeeds in Turkey, but is there a country that you look at and go, it can work here?
Yes, the answer is that democracy can succeed, and I think that there is an evolutionary stage that's underway in many of these countries. Egypt's a mess right now, but if you go back to our own revolution, very different circumstances, but we fought rebellions, the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellions, you know. We had lots of turmoil for decades after the initial, and we still were fighting wars in 1812, and we were fighting the French, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the fact is, these are never pretty. If you want pretty, you get a dictatorship. If you want messy, you get a democracy. We're now in the messy phase, and it's not going to be easy. And I think there are things we can do. And I think the president was very smart in his speech 2 years ago. The overlooked part of his speech, everybody focused on that one line about the 67 borders, the one he gave at the State Department, when he talked about the Arab Spring, I think, in a very thoughtful way. We didn't start it, we didn't lead it, we can't direct it, all we can do is be supportive, and they laid out some of the things we can do. Congress ought to just do what the president asked, and that is provide some of the support we need to help Egypt, to help Tunisia, to help Morocco, to help Jordan, to help these countries get through this transition phase that they're in right now. Each one of them has a different transition phase underway, but I think all of them are moving in a very positive direction. Even Egypt is.
Tunisia is the one
Tunisia's
moving in a positive.
It's moving. There are some very dangerous currents underway. There are Salafi movements underway, but they need help. I mean, what all these countries need is infrastructure, jobs, healthcare, education, the building blocks of a moderate middle class civil society. That's what they don't have, and that's what they need. That's what we can do. Listen, I didn't get all the questions. My email address is jzogby@aaiusa. jzogby@aaiusa. Any question you write me, I will respond to. I never.
I really can't. We really need to move on. I'm sorry.
You buy a book and I'll say we'll talk then. Thank you. Sorry.